Welcome, everyone. You are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Captain's Table podcast being brought to you in collaboration with The Last Dinosaur. Today's guest is Pamela Mar, Managing Director of the Digital Standards Initiative of the International Chamber of Commerce. The International Chamber of Commerce is the largest, most representative business organization in the world. ICC represents over 45 million businesses in over 170 countries who have interests spanning every sector of the private enterprise. We're going to focus a little bit on maritime and, of course, trade. Pamela, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much.
I'm really excited about this because, if you look at hierarchy, you kind of have global trade and then maritime is a big chunk under that. So talk to us a little bit, Pamela, about all the things, or at least some of the things that the ICC does, but really kind of focused in on the maritime and trade aspect. People are probably sitting here going, hey, Chris, what about a ship owner or a charter? And I said, well, this all kind of revolves around global trade. So if you could talk to us a little bit about that, I'd love to hear.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity to participate in your podcast. So ICC, as you said in your introduction, represents 45 million businesses. So if you think about how business interacts with government, ICC is basically set up to represent the voice of business to government. That's at the global and national and regional levels. The reason that ICC is very interested in trade is that basically trade is seen as a bearer of prosperity. It brings stability. It provides opportunities for growth. And so ICC has always, since its founding in the early 20th century, stood for kind of the merchant of peace, in that traders will help countries connect, keep the peace. ICC was set up in the embers of World War I. And so the whole message is trade for prosperity. Now, the reason that obviously the maritime industry figures so prominently in that is because over 90% of global trade actually travels by sea. So if you think about how we as ICC achieve our mission of setting rules and standards and governance frameworks that enable trade to move more fluidly, to take place, to bring that development that we're all working for, the maritime industry is necessary as a point of focus. So that's kind of why ICC has also set up the Digital Standards Initiative, and why one of our first ports of call, so to speak, is actually the maritime industry, is simply because unless you address issues within the maritime industry that are salient to trade, we won't get anywhere.
And when you talk about the standards initiative, can you talk a little bit about, like, are you talking about things like the terms of trade or bills of lading? Can you flesh that out a little bit? Because I think that that's really interesting to get to a little bit to that next level there.
So ICC, obviously we do policy advocacy, but one of the key reasons that ICC has become influential is that we really set the rules for trade through what's called Incoterms. And these are commercial terms for contracts for all types of trade. And there are things, measures and frameworks that business buys into, and they help to harmonize a lot of sort of national standards so that businesses can expand globally. Now, as trade has evolved, Incoterms has really powered that. But when technology has advanced, especially in the 21st century, we need to sort of update analog trade to take advantage of digital. And that's not only because digital is obviously faster, more efficient, and more kind of time saving, but digital can also make trade a lot more transparent. And that really allows us to understand, who's trading with whom, and also aggregate data, which will enable trade to actually be more inclusive and to address kind of growth and development issues. So if we think about ICC's purpose in setting up the Digital Standards Initiative, as technology has progressed, trade has basically remained pretty analog. And there's reasons for that. One, that digital standards aren't clear, that they're complex, that rules aren't harmonized, that countries are slow to update their digital kind of trade and digital economy legal frameworks. So ICC basically set up DSI with the support of WTO, World Customs Organization, the Singapore government, which is a big player in digital everything, and the Asian Development Bank, to really address these key blockers on the road to digitalizing the global trade ecosystem. Honestly, I've never heard anyone say they're against digitalization of trade. The question is how. And so that's what DSI is doing. We're trying to provide the frameworks that allow harmonization of digital trade processes, rules, and especially documentation, because trade is all about trade works because of documents, right? Trade documents. They set the conditions and they outline and articulate how every transaction takes place. So you absolutely need a form of markers for the entire supply chain, but those need to be digital. So DSI was set up to go through these and harmonize them and make sure that in the end, we can all connect together through the data contained in the supply chain. And then the legal reform, obviously, this needs to take place to permission the use of electronic records in trade. And then the last aspect is digital trust. This agreement that if we're all going to transact in digital, in electronic records, in data, then we should also have a common understanding of how we share data, how we secure data, how we handle it, how you tag it, how you trace it. So it's a technology neutral concept, but we need to be able to trust data that's incoming and also handle that properly. So that's why DSI was set up. And we're pretty young. We're just 3 years old. Momentum is strong because we're addressing problems that have just existed for years.
Right.
And it's only if you get kind of a neutral public interest organization without any commercial interest to set this up, we can bring together government and business and the expertise of the scientific and academic community and the technical community to really work for the public interest and to try to expand trade by digitalizing it so that more businesses can participate. Oh, sorry, long-winded answer
No,
to
that's
your
it.
question.
So there's a ton to unpack, and one thing that kind of came to my mind is you talked about the analog, its current state. It's still a lot of it is analog, and I was thinking, well, you can have a whole podcast about that, except you can't do the last dinosaur. We call it maybe the last mastodon or something. Maybe you're a little closer to where we are, but still kind of like an old one. But I think a lot if you look at that. So you're talking about the terms. So you talk about things like CIF, FOB, and that those sort of things, and how you trade on those different terms, which those term sheets have been around forever. But you're also talking about, if I understand this, things like bills of lading, letters of credit, all these things that are, a day-to-day part of all of those things are day-to-day part of the maritime industry. And like you said, you joke around a little bit of being the last dinosaur, but it's kind of going in step change, these kind of changes in the industry. Maritime, I know the IMO tries, and there tries to be certain, folks to get more digital, but a little bit seems to be because there's one less body in terms of the digital part of it, that people are doing it at different levels, some more advanced than others. And then you throw in the whole idea of satellite communication, some more advanced than others as well. But those are different topics. But I'd like to talk to you a little bit about, you said nobody's opposed to this idea, but a lot of it has to have, you must see some challenges. So not to get into all of them, what are some of the bigger challenges that you see to kind of implementing this? Because I think this is really interesting. It doesn't sound like it's maybe a technology challenge or a willingness challenge, but there's got to be something that's really, causing it to be, to kind of move along at a slower pace, perhaps.
So I think the biggest challenge is that every supply chain has 20 to 30 to 40 to 50 different players, service providers, manufacturers, buyers, and all these intermediaries. And basically, everyone has been digitalizing in their own silo, so to speak. So, for example, the airway bill is over 50% digitalized. So, if you look at the airway bills, that their digitalization adoption is actually quite high because it's sort of under the purview of a multilateral organization, which has the responsibility to coordinate and drive adoption. There's other trade documents which are similarly digitalized, but in order for supply chain data sharing to work, you actually need to align those individual digitalization efforts to each other at the level of data. Because what we find is that there's a pretty much a finite number of data elements within all 36 key trade documents which need to be shared. So we're not trying to make every document 100% harmonized with every other of the 36. All we're focusing on is making those core 189 data elements that exist across the 36 documents shareable. So we're taking on, it's a massive task because there's a lot of different organizations involved, but we think it's actually doable. But it requires coordination, it requires alignment, it requires some give and take between organizations which have built up their whole membership and their whole kind of reason to exist around their data models or their programs for digitalization. So we need to establish those connections, and pretty much many organizations understand and agree that we should have interoperability at the level of data, but it takes time. So we are working on that.
So
The second,
it's
go ahead.
it's kind of like, when I was studying, if you've listened to the podcast before, when I was studying for my exams, for the to get my third mate's license, they stack a pile of books on your desk. And it's like a few thousand, 10,000 questions. It's all the possible questions that the Coast Guard could answer, it could ask you. And then the question is asked is, how do you eat an elephant? And I'm not advocating eating an elephant. And if you do, that's your thing. I'm not trying to get into cultural appropriation or anything wrong. How do you eat an elephant? One piece at a time. And it sounds like that's really has to be the approach. It's just one piece at a time. It's okay. Well, yes, we have because you have what I'm hearing is the different documents and the different data points. And if you look at like permutations of that, you're talking about a lot of different permutations, but then you have to start with, okay, well, what are some of the basic things we can kind of zip through very
Yes.
quickly? And then, okay, what's the next level? Maybe a little bit more, maybe not everybody uses them, but 80% of the people use them. Let's go through those and then get through. Because it sounds like that has to be the approach, really.
Yes. So we started with the analysis of the trade documents, the
Right.
identification of the data which is more important than others, and that data must absolutely be standardized. It must be correct. Otherwise, the supply chain sharing concept will actually fail.
Right.
And those data need to be verified, secured, and traced. So that's your supply chain single source of truth. So we're
Right.
absolutely focused on that. And then the second thing is that we need to drive adoption. Now, for adoption, we need to go by parts of the supply chain where digitalization will actually yield a measurable benefit, because that's how businesses work,
Right.
right? They look at and the investment is dislocation, probably training, learning new processes. The same employees probably have to do the analog process and the digital one at the same time for some time, right? Because you want to retain the employees because they have all the knowledge, but they need to learn digital. So
Right.
everyone's workload increases, and you have to give businesses a reason to make that investment. And so
Right.
we choose those parts of the supply chain, first, which are easy to bite off, and second, where the benefit is really visible to the people who are being displaced. So that's why the EBL is one of the first documents, because it is really identifiable, right? It contains all of the critical information on the supply chain. And also for shippers, you only have 9 or 10 of them in the world. And so if one big shipper makes that decision, or one big commodities player makes that decision, they can you can actually create that critical mass, which enables wide scale benefit, which is very measurable. The contrast would be, if we aim to digitalize the commercial invoice, right? Even if many supply chains adopt them, it's really difficult to actually measure because it's inside the company.
Right,
So
right, right.
that's kind of why we chose the EBL. And the EBL has, thankfully, due to the hard work of industry organizations like the Digital Container Shipping Association, that it's highly harmonized. There's largely agreement on the approach, and it is already in use in some parts of the supply chain, in some parts of global trade. So we can actually create case studies, which are then used to sort of sell the concept of digitalization to others who either may be seeking guidance or haven't made their decision, or are really looking at the really practical aspects, like how much time and money do I save and what do I get?
I look at it, from a slightly different view, and that is, of course, on the bulk side of things, right? Which talk about, like, kind of the hierarchy. Yeah, you want to get the Maersks, the ones these, the container guys, and then it could be
Mm-hmm.
an easier side sell for the companies that do things in bulk. And again, you probably could target a few of the big traders, a few of the big oil cos. I would imagine that their BLs are pretty similar. Plus, you're also
Mm-hmm.
talking about a far less complicated voyage, meaning typically on an oil tanker, you have one, maybe two BL holders, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't have a container,
Right.
a box container ship holding 10,000 containers, each one with one BL, maybe two. I don't even know. Like, could you get multiple BLs on within a container? So it seems like that's where the low hanging fruit is, because I did have somebody on from Secro, who's one of the companies that are
Mm-hmm.
involved in the electronic bill of lading
Mm-hmm.
using blockchain, and it really made a lot of sense,
Mm-hmm.
because not only can you track it better, but the BL, in addition to service having three main kind of historically taught things, aspects to it, it also acts as collateral for some
Mm-hmm.
BLs. And and banks can hold it in their
Mm-hmm.
safe, and then it could go against their, or be loaned against, and all
Mm-hmm.
these sort of things. That's one part of it that I'm sure you guys are looking at to try to figure out and make sure that everybody can still have that functionality.
Yes, absolutely. If you can digitalize the bill of lading, that not only makes the shipping process simpler and more transparent, but it also provides data for financing. So
Right.
that is a really critical part. And by the way, the players who are involved in trade finance, they're already going digital themselves. So that digital BL just slots into their system and they can run with it, which is another reason that we like to focus on the BL, is because everyone who deals with a BL can be taught, how to use it. And so it becomes immediately effective.
And you talked about a lot about collaboration. I know with the BL side, you did have to get a lot of not only governments but legal and all
Mm-hmm.
these different aspects together, really, to kind of say, yes, this can work. I mean, the BL has to be one of the oldest trade documents
Mm-hmm.
recorded. Really, I think this also becomes a little bit of what you're trying to do is a change management part as well. You have to,
Mm-hmm.
like, change people's ideas.
Included in the change management is actually government, because they're the ones who need to permission the use of electronic transferable records in the place of paper.
Right.
I would say that the business change process may be slightly easier because business is used to the ebbs and flows and evolutions and the changes that they're required to do as a part and parcel of doing business. Government is usually slower to react. They have a lot more governance restrictions in acting fast. They've got to consult, they've got to join up. And so when we work with governments to try to support them to update their legal frameworks, in order to align to the model law on electronic transferable records. And it is absolutely not a simple process. The actual legislative process could be simple in that a country could simply just amend their electronic transactions ordinance if one exists. And that could be a page and a half, 2 page, 3 page. But joining up all the parts of government which have to be involved, including trade, finance, customs, border security, all of that needs to be done. And so that's why the process to change this one little thing in government actually takes 2 or 3 years. So we've had actually good progress. The UK passed the Electronic Trade Documents Act last September 2023.
Yep.
France legislated in a similar manner earlier this year. A number of countries have committed to do so. So altogether, 37% of global GDP have already aligned to this legal framework, and another 27% of global GDP have publicly committed and are working through what it takes in order to get all their systems aligned so that they can actually implement this and let business have the confidence that they will not be asked for a paper BL or a paper trade document in a court of law, and give insurers and financials the confidence that all of this documents are legal tender. That is such an important part of driving adoption, because honestly, if a business will be asked in a dispute, show me the paper invoice or show me the paper promissory note, they won't make the investment. It's just too risky.
Right,
so
right. They don't want to have it come
really,
to that claim or that, or something
exactly.
else, right? Yeah, that's where at least from the maritime side, the P&I clubs have to really get their arms around it, which it sounds like that they are. Certainly you need to have all those folks to say, yeah, we're not going to be in some arbitration in London or Houston or Singapore, and all of a sudden somebody asks for a paper BL. You're like, well, no, it's right here. Well, how do I, then all of a sudden, the wheels will fall off pretty quickly. One of the questions that I'm kind of thinking about this as you're talking about governments and organizations and putting governments on the side, because I think you kind of explained that. Why do you think some companies and organizations are a little bit more like, oh yeah, we're all in, where others are a little bit more hesitant about joining? When again, you talk about something like the BL, I think the benefits can be seen pretty seamlessly. But talk to me a little bit about why you see that some companies, it doesn't have to be specific to maritime, but why some companies are like, I'm all in, let's start this process. And other companies are maybe not first or early mover, but in that bell curve of being more to the left, really like late adopters.
We would like to believe that the driver is the commitment of the top management. I think it's probably a lot more complex than that. And it's related to, for example, where you sit in the supply chain. So in a lot of consumer supply chains and also industrial supply chains, the buyer's king. So if the buyer sets standards, the buyer sets the pace of digitalization, the buyer sets which platforms to use. And so if you're a manufacturer or a service provider, you really don't have that much of a choice. In fact, it becomes an issue of you do what the buyer wants you to do, because that's how you keep the business. Now, the problem is, of course, you don't have just one customer. You would probably have 10, 20, sometimes 30 customers, all of who have different data needs, different digitalization prerogatives, and different requirements for you to serve them. So then it's just a question of complexity. How are you basically swimming in a sea that is very rough? And so it's just a question of survival. So I think that where you sit in the supply chain has a lot to do with your pace of digitalization. I think for when it comes to those who are really at liberty to determine their own agenda, so buyers, large players, and so on, for them, it's all about how much can I gain as business competitive advantage from undertaking digitalization? And I haven't seen a lot in terms of labor saving. Like they're not trying to save employee cost. It's really about the data and about speed and about transparency. Because in supply chain today, you need to be fast, you need to have auditable data trails, and you need to have data that can be aggregated and combined so that you have more insight about the market than you previously did. Every company has a lot of information, but not and every company has a lot of data, but not all that information and data can actually be aggregated, structured, and sort of packaged into insights. So it's all about taking that transition head on and to really seek to become, no matter what you do, a data and services company. And that's really a driver of digitalization. And then that's about new markets, new products, services, and new competitive advantages. And then I think the last kind of determinant of why some companies move really fast and really perform well in digitalization is their absolute amount of resources and the environment that they're in. So you have a finite sort of potty of resources and you have access to finance. So that means that companies which have more working capital, better access to finance, probably they're in the developed world as well because the emerging markets are underserved in all
Right.
of that. And then it's actually your environment. So, for example, in a highly digital environment like China, right, where people have stopped using cash, they've stopped using paper documents. If you go buy something at 7-Eleven, you're actually, or at a convenience store, you're not using cash, you're using electronic payment. So even if you drive into a parking lot, there's no arm. It's actually totally driven by digital, right? Reading your license plate, connecting that to your phone, charging you by the minute. And so if you're in that environment, your whole mindset of kind of approach to digitalization is I have to move. I have to keep going forward in technology. I have to adopt it. Whereas if you're in some other countries which are slower to, adopt digital technologies, then yeah, you can get by without going digital because that's everybody is.
Right, right, right. And I think you talk a little bit about in the beginning of about where top management is, and I also think too as there's a changing of the guard, and especially in the maritime space
Mm-hmm.
where you do see maybe a little bit of the older generation, still some boomers,
Mm-hmm.
the boomer generation
Mm-hmm.
running, and yes, to a lot of credit, I do see some of those that generation is maybe turning the reins over to their children who are, let's say, millennials
Mm-hmm.
or younger Gen X. I'm Gen X, and turning it over to them, and they're a little bit more in that kind of mindset of let's make it digital. And I think that I've seen it serve pretty well in the sense of they don't do it all at once. It's maybe a more cautious approach than what
Cautious.
your example of China, where everything is all digital. Uh, but at the same time there is that let's see what's out there, let's
Mm-hmm.
adopt this a piece at a time. And I do think I did have a ship owner on, granted it was for the Great Lakes, which was really cool, and he talked about like some of the adoption of the things that they did, and it was never about headcount. He's like, no, it
Mm-hmm.
was about making it safer. It was about
Yes.
things on the ship, making it safer, making it better for the crew and all these other things, not to replace crew. So I think that that's the
Mm-hmm.
other part that needs to be considered. People don't want to be like, well, I'm going to implement this and out of a job. No, we still need people to analyze the data,
Mm-hmm.
like you said. I had somebody else on saying that because of certain limitations and the way that bridge equipment is and other ship equipment is set up, we only get about 10% of all the data off the ship to analyze it. So it's a similar type thing. Like what you're saying
Mm-hmm.
is like we only analyze a certain percent of trade, and if a company had more deep analysis into how they do business, whom they do business with, seasonality,
Mm-hmm.
how it pegs against different currencies, then they can make better trade decisions. But it's not going to be like, oh, I'm going to make 10% more this year.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be a little bit more of a it's going to be a little harder to track, especially at first, I
Mm-hmm.
think. I usually ask about why people should get into the maritime space. I'm not going to ask that. So why people should get involved with or be part of what you're doing?
So every one of us benefits from global trade, from access to products, access to goods that we use every day, and access to services which are provided all around the world. And so if you have any interest in enabling things to be cheaper, faster, and more accessible to everyone, you will want to see faster digitalization of global trade. It will also give us more information that we can use to solve problems like the income gap and transparency, and pretty much figure out where goods have come from so that we could actually tell the story of every good that you might see in the store.
I think that's very good. And I also think, and we didn't get a chance to talk about it, it also plays in a little bit on the decarbonization effort.
Mm-hmm.
And that as you could start to track this, you could start to see what trade routes are beneficial in terms of
Mm-hmm.
efficiency in trade and things like that. I mean, there's a whole other aspect that I'm
Yeah,
sure we could talk
absolutely.
about as well. And finally, doing all this, I don't know if you travel a lot, you probably do. What do you throw in your carry-on when you head onto a plane? What are you reading these days?
So I'm a big fan of Haruki Murakami, and a big fan of a philosopher called Mark Nepo. So he's a poet, philosopher. He keeps me grounded. So Murakami keeps me up in the air, and Mark Nepo brings me back down to the ground.
That's awesome. I've only read one book. I think it was the one with the two moons. That was it 1984 that well, no, was it that one? I read one of his very popular ones and it
They're
was just
all popular.
yeah,
You
and
should read more.
it was just now that you mention that, I really haven't, and it was like super thick, and I'm like, oh, there, and once you get sucked in, his writing is just
Yep.
wonderful. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Well, Pamela, thank you for coming on and talk about the ICC and what you're doing and how it relates to maritime and trade and how it all fits in. I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.